Okay, so the recording has started and the transcription is also going, if that's helpful for you. So let's talk a wee bit about ITIL and how it's used, why you might want to use it. So as you've heard, it was a system that was introduced. Sorry, hang on. That's better. The transcription was coming up in my screen and it was really putting me off because I would say something and I would be saying something else and then the last wee bit would come up on the screen and it was really confusing me. So it was created by the UK government originally. And it was brought in because IT was, and probably has, taken over. It's almost impossible to imagine any sort of business now, any sort of organisation not using IT to some extent. So if that's going to be the case, perhaps what we should do is have a clear idea of what that relationship is and what it should be. Now, it's not about IT in that sense. It's not about tech. It's not about software or hardware. So ITIL isn't about saying, oh, go out and buy a Cisco router, go out and buy an IBM mainframe. That's not the point. The point is to try and better understand the relationship between the business needs and the IT that's put in place to support those needs. The other thing that it's really useful for, and part of the reason we cover it in this module, is as it is an industry standard, and in fact it also links into international standards organisations standards as well. Because it is that standard, if it's followed, you can very easily make the case for saying, well, we are compliant. We have followed the international standard for procurement, for service, for however you choose to implement it. So it gives you that comfort that what you're doing conforms to industry standards, industry norms, and is something that is recognised by other people as that being the case. So it becomes really helpful for somebody who is in a GRC role. Now, I said it came from the UK government, and part of the reason that it was introduced was because in the early days, there was no standardisation. People would be sold a tool in the same way as they would be sold a spade or a shovel. Now, I'm not entirely sure what the difference is between a spade and a shovel, but I know there is one. And I know they do slightly different jobs, even though they look fairly similar. And the same sort of thing was happening with IT. People in different departments, even different people within departments, would go out and buy systems that would solve the problem that they had. If their problem was recording staff attendance, they would buy a system that supported that. And if their problem was supporting staff pay, they would buy a system that did that. Now, there's very clearly a link between staff attendance and staff pay. But all too often, the systems that were bought wouldn't talk to each other. So you'd have one system somewhere that knew how long people had been in, how many hours they should be paid for, and you had a system somewhere else that would actually go and prepare that and calculate how much they'd be paid. But there's nothing in between them to say, yeah, we'll just take one from the other. So there was a very haphazard implementation schedule, if it was scheduled at all. So different manufacturers would have different standards because that was helpful for the manufacturers. If you'd bought into Digital Equipment Corporation's way of networking computers, then you would buy more DEC equipment. If you'd bought IBM, then you would buy more IBM because it was a path of least resistance. So there were different standards, different operating systems, different practices, different ways of working. And if you're the UK government, supporting all that becomes a nightmare. So the idea with ITIL was to standardise that procurement. It was to try and think about how IT systems are procured. And key to it is the right-hand side there, value. Is there value to be gained from the system? What system? Well, presumably at some point there's a demand for a system, or there may be an opportunity for something that you hadn't realised was even possible to be computerised. But there's no point saying, oh, well, we have this opportunity, let's do it. We need to think about the whole system under those various titles there, and whether it provides value for the organisation as a whole. And you'll see that the way that diagram is laid out, that we have things like the guiding principles of the organisation, so the sorts of stuff that was spoken about before. What is the organisation there to do? What is its purpose? All of the stuff about implementing an IT system clearly has to be part of the organisation's aims. We've talked about continually improving organisations. We've talked about PDCA. So any system that you bring in has to be part of that continual improvement process. So you can see that they envelop the whole thing. Nothing can happen unless it follows those. Similarly, it has to include the governance structures for your organisation and the practices that are already included. And inside that, you have to start to think about what value you're getting for your procurement. So let's look about that. Let's look at that in a wee bit more detail, starting with that biggest outside one of guiding principles. And the first principle is, if you're doing something, it must provide value for the organisation. Now that's sometimes an issue, particularly for people like us who possibly enjoy IT for its own sake. I like a new toy as much as anyone. And I might think that buying an iPad for everybody in the organisation is a great idea. But can we actually get value from that? Or is it just the latest toy that people are seeing and want to play with? Can you demonstrate that what you're doing generates value for the business? So just going out and buying iPads wouldn't be enough. The fact that other people have iPads, that's neither here nor there. On the other hand, if you can present a business case that says, well, okay, we have meetings. And for each of those meetings, we have agenda packs that are 100 pages, which we have to print at 5p a page. So that's £5 to print an agenda pack. We have those meetings every fortnight, so that's 26 weeks a year. So that's £130 to print one person's agenda pack for 1 year. So over 2 years, that's £260. If we can buy people an iPad at £200, we save £60 over 2 years and help save the planet because we're not printing all this stuff. That then becomes a value business case. So whatever you're doing has to take these things into account. It has to say, what is the business need? Not what's the latest toy, not what's the latest thing I've been interested. How does it benefit the organisation? And one of the things that you have to take into account when you're thinking about the organisation is where it currently is. Because it's rare that you get the chance to work on a brand new organisation. Far more likely that you'll be working with organisations that have existed, that already have processes in place, that already have computing systems in place, that already have all the other accoutrements of any functioning organisation. So you have to start from where you are and improve that. And it's extremely unusual for the optimal case to be pull out everything that exists and put in a whole new set of stuff. That's just unlikely and expensive and therefore unlikely to be greenlit anyway. So start with where you are and figure out how you can improve what you have, get better. So again, we're back to this PDCA thing. What's our next goal? Can we reach that goal? Good, we've got better. What's our next goal? So you remember that diagram that we had? It was the PDCA wheel going up the hill. And we'll continually try and iteratively improve. And the only way you can do that is if the people that you're working with are on board. It's all very well you running in and being really excited about a new computer system, but will the people that have to use it be as excited? Will it help them in their job, or will it take more time and effort for them to do what they have been doing? Is there a sound reason for bringing it in that would justify that disruption, if that's what you're going to do? Everybody that's involved should be involved. If all that happens is management swoop in and go, here you go, new system, get on with it, mush, mush, that's just a way of building resentment within an organisation and should be avoided at all costs. Only an incompetent management would do that sort of thing. So you have to think about the people and you have to think about the whole organisation. Not just your wee bit, not just a wee thing that you're implementing, the whole organisation. That's why the guiding principles encompass that whole organisation. They surround the whole process. And that's why you have to take into account the systems that you have, the people that you have, the processes that you have. And you have to provide value for all of that. And if you can do that as simply as possible, all the better. At the end, though, what you want to do is ensure that you create a system that is as automated as possible. So going back to the example that I started with, if you have a system that records staff attendance and you have a system calculating staff pay, if you have to print out staff attendance and manually type it into the system that creates the staff pay, then you have a problem. It's manual work, which is what we want to eradicate anyway. It's prone to error. If you're taking a whole sheet of figures and typing them in, you're likely to make a mistake. So let's try and ensure that the systems that we're putting in will have as much automation as possible. Take all of the systems that we can automate and do that if we possibly can. Now, to do that, of course, you need to get buy-in. You need to get buy-in as we've already said, from the people that are going to use the systems, but you also need to get buy-in from the people that are in charge. You need to get governance buy-in, and however that's expressed in your organisation. Unless you have that governance buy-in, you won't get the go-ahead to do what you want to do. All of this, of course, should also be taken in the context of creating continual improvement for your organisation. Again, this PDCA stuff. Can we be better? Because we should be better. That's the whole point. So again, as with the other principles, as with governance, what we're doing is enveloping this whole practice in the idea of continual improvement for our organisation. As I say, it envelops everything. You don't do anything unless you have that as part of your whole reason for doing these things. So that involves knowing what improvement looks like. You can't say, oh yes, we want to improve. Well, how do you want to improve? Oh, we just want to get better. Yeah, I heard that, but how are you going to get better? So you need to understand what better means in your case. Better is a very subjective term, of course. So it helps to understand where you're starting from and what you want to get to. There's all sorts of ways of approaching this. A common one is to use something called a KPI, a key performance indicator. You know, it might be staff absences. You want to minimize staff absences, and you can get a figure that's a percentage. Not only is it a key indicator, it's something that you can compare with other people to see whether you're doing better or worse than they are, which allows you to compare your organisation not just from where you started and where you're going, but with other or similar organisations. So we have to understand what those indicators are and what we're going to do with them. And as we discussed before, you take that action, figure out if we got there, and then go back to the start to keep that continual improvement going. Now remember, this isn't the PCDA stuff, PDCA stuff. This is similar to it, but involved in the ITIL standard. It's part of the reason we looked at it earlier. All of these standards embrace that idea of continual improvement. And that can only happen if the way that you do things, your practices, are involved. Now remember, this is before we even get to the thing that we are actually doing. This is all the stuff that we have to consider before we do the thing that we're actually doing. This is all the stuff that goes around it. This is all the GRC stuff around it, including practices. Now, there's 34 of them in the ITIL standard. We're not going to cover all of them, not surprisingly. In fact, we're only really going to mention them to give you a flavour for what they are. And they come under 3 headings of general service and technical management practices. Now, there are similar things with COBIT, and when we look at COBIT, one of the things I want you to do is compare and contrast with those, and that would also be a useful thing to reflect on for your case study. So these practices that envelop everything, these general service and technical ones, and of course, for us with our background, we're probably more interested in the technical ones, but we have to engage with the general ones and the service ones too, might include things like this: the strategy, the architecture, the workforce. Oh, look at that, risk management, including links to ISO standards. The R in GRC is also included in ITIL because that's a general management practice that we should be carrying out. And of course, if you're going to change anything, organizational change management is really helpful, as is managing that process, as is having a relationship with the people that's applying the stuff. So all of these things are included in the just being a decent manager. Then you have specific things for particular services. So you might have different skill sets depending on which part of the organisation that you belong. If you're in finance, being an accountant would be quite helpful. If you're in IT, understanding IT would be quite helpful. If you're in engineering, having an engineering background would be quite helpful. So understanding the business, being able to analyse it, understand what's required, what services are needed, how they are going to work, and then putting in all the things around them, the stuff that you heard in that video, things like service management and help desk management and incident management, all of that kind of stuff comes into this. So before you even go ahead and implement a new system, you have to think about all these things that are going to have to happen as part of that implementation before you even get to the technical stuff, before you figure out how you're going to deploy that, before you figure out what the system is going to be. Any questions before we move on? Nope, all happy?
Yes, we have no questions.
Okay, so we have this whole ITIL service chain, which has shrunk for some reason. So any opportunity that we have has to take place in all this. And only after we have that can we actually look at what we're going to do inside this service value chain. So that explodes into something like this, where we have still the demand and the value at each edge, but inside that, we are talking about planning the new service, how it improves what we are going to do, how we engage with our users, so all the stuff that we've been talking about, how we design the transition, how we obtain it, who do we obtain it from, how do we deliver and support it. And only after we've done all this stuff do we even start thinking about, oh yeah, okay, so what is it we're actually going to implement here? Any of you that have done programming, it's the same kind of idea. You think about what you're going to do before you actually go ahead and do it. So you understand what's good for your business, and after that you figure out if there's products or services that you can usefully use for that, not the other way around. So you rethink about all these under all of these different headings, including the service part. And there is a ISO, International Standards Organization 20,000. There is a standard for IT service management, which again you should go and look at. And again, you should compare it to things like ITIL and COBIT, whilst being aware that actually the ISO standard incorporates things that come out of ITIL and COBIT. So this international standard incorporates the ideas that were first created in these systems. And that's part of the reason we know that if we use them, we can be sure of our compliance, because it is a standard. So one of the things that ISO does is look at what's available and it says, yeah, okay, we'll take that, that's good. Let's incorporate that. Things like the Microsoft Operations Framework also go in there. So that's from a vendor, but it's a framework that is useful, and even though it comes from Microsoft, isn't specific for Microsoft products. So the framework itself can be used for all sorts of things. So there's lots of bits to ISO, lots of bits to all the international standards, and you'll see them identified with the ISO 20000, and then there'll be a slash and a number. So all the things that you see, we'll talk about the different sections. So for ITIL, what we're interested in is the service management part, because that's what ITIL is, it's about service management. So the ISO stuff tries to get you to define all these things, tries to understand the concept, tries to understand the leadership. In other words, it tries to understand all these things that we've been talking about all the way through our ITIL stuff. Any questions? No? Okay, in that case, what I think we will do, that's been best part of an hour, so that's ITIL. We also want to cover COBIT, but I think what we'll do is we will take a break before we start COBIT. So why don't you take 15 minutes to grab a cup of tea, and I'll see you back here in 15. Okay?
Thank you.
All right, no problem.
Okay, and we are back. Everyone managed to get a cup of tea? Cheers.
Cheers.
All right, so we had a look at ITIL. So what I want to do now is move on to COBIT. So same kind of idea as with ITIL. COBIT came from America. But again, it's the idea about having a framework. And there's only so many things I can say while my computer's churning away here. There we go. So, the idea is we're trying to put a framework in place again for our, goodness sake. Right, sorry, let's just try this again. Okay, are you seeing it now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, the idea again is to put a framework in place for any IT that we are going to implement. As I say, it came from America and it's the most common one over there. And part of the reason we're looking at it is it also contributes to the ISO standard. And of course, for multinational companies, they tend to want to use more than one framework to conform to all the areas in which they trade. So actually, even though it came from the US, it's often used over here and in the rest of the world as well. So it's about IT governance and how best to work that, how best to implement that. And there's links to the governing body of COBIT in your documents. But again, it's this idea that IT doesn't exist on its own. It's there to serve the business. It's there for a business reason. So it tries to split up the whole idea of IT into these 4 different sections that it calls domains. And again, please compare and contrast these with both ITIL and PDCA, because of course the first domain is to plan. Second domain is to get the stuff, so do it. And then it has to be delivered and supported, but then you're monitoring and evaluating, so checking and acting. So these 4 main domains are how they would look at any IT implementation. Now, it goes into far more detail. So these domains have 34 sub-processes. And again, you can go and have a look at those. But again, the similarities to good governance, the similarities to other frameworks, such as ITIL, to international standards, to the whole idea of continual improvement in PDCA, they are all encompassed in these things. And the idea is the same as with ITIL. If you embrace the COBIT standard, if you follow the COBIT rules and regulations, then your compliance is likely to be okay, including things like data retention. which is a hugely important part of any organisation's legislative compliance. So, for example, government organisations might have to store all of their emails for 7 years. I might have got that number wrong, but I think it's right. If you're a financial organisation, like a bank, you have to store financial records for decades. I think in the UK it's 25 years. Again, you can check for me and let me know if I've got the number wrong. Embracing things like COBIT, things like ITIL, things like ISO 20000, these all contribute to saying, look, we have embraced this, we have done what we could, we have embraced the best available standards. So if something goes wrong, you have a plausible way of saying, well, yes, something went wrong because things always go wrong, but what we did was entirely reasonable. Because we covered our bases, we did what everybody says is the best thing to do. So if you embrace these things and adopt them, it means that you have some support to say, no, we did this the right way. So it allows you to perform your compliance duties. It allows you to hopefully create better IT systems by ensuring that your information management is correct, by ensuring that you understand the resources that you have. So if you cyber guys want to implement a new router somewhere, a new 20,000 router, you're going to have to make a business case. And if anybody goes and looks at the stats and says, well, you know, that router has been in place for less than 2 years, it's working at 38% capacity, and there are negligible numbers of bad or misrouted packets. Why you want to spend £20,000 of my money again? And if it's just because it's the new thing and you've got a nice new brochure and you fancy playing with some new tech, that's not enough. So hopefully it helps the business lower its costs as well. What's in there? Well, there's the framework. So you look at your IT setup and make sure that that is linked explicitly to what the business is doing. To ensure that the things that you have are all serving business aims and that there's not competing systems in there. Is there, for example, a single source of truth? If you want to know a piece of information, is it stored in one place or are there multiple places and it's replicated? That's never a good idea. So you have to understand the processes that happen within the business. And this is where the IT world, the business world sort of blend into each other. You can't create an IT process if you don't understand the business process behind it. So you have to be more than just a technical person. You have to start understanding business and understanding the business processes too. Apart from anything else, that means you're able to talk about what you're doing in ways that other people will understand. So again, there's no point in running into a meeting and going, oh yeah, we've got a new router that's going to process and route our TCP and UDP packets over our IP network with a 7% increase in efficiency using better domain subnetting. Well, it might do, but I guarantee you've lost everybody in the room. So that might be an appendix, but what's up front is we can make things go 10% faster and it will cost you £15,000. PDCA, we're planning. What are you planning? You're planning an improvement. How are we going to do it? We're going to put in this new bit of equipment. And then once you do, you check that it's done what you said it would. It has increased speeds by 10%. And if not, you act. Did you not set up the router properly? Were your assumptions incorrect? What happened? So again, you're thinking of this IT and business not as competing, but as absolutely complementary and intertwined. So you've got the framework, you've got process descriptions, you've got your objectives. How are you going to understand whether things are doing what you said they would? Are you getting that 10% throughput? Is it actually working? And if not, who do we talk to? No, I'm not deliberately not saying blame. I'm saying who do we talk to? We were expecting 10% increase. It's not happened. So whose responsibility is it to start looking at that and understanding what the difference is? Or we were expecting 10% and we've got 15%. Who is responsible for that? These things can work both ways. So you have to understand what your objectives are, have to understand how you're going to measure those, and have to understand how they relate to everything else that's going on. And as your system progresses, you have to understand how that fits in with the rest of the business and make sure that there's nothing left out, bits that you should have done and could do now, bits that you never did do and perhaps could usefully be implemented. So are there any questions about that? Nope, okay. So as is usual, your tutorial is going to feed straight into your case study. So what I want you to do is have a think about these frameworks, their similarities, their differences, the ones that we've explicitly talked about and the ones that we have touched on, the ISO standards. So we looked at 31,000 when we talked about risk and 20,000 when we're talking about our service management today. And there's links to those in the module materials. So you want to think about why they're there, what they're used for, how they could usefully help your case study business, and how the principles of PDCA are encompassed in those. Okay, so if there are no questions, let me stop the recording.